Liam Carter was known for his reckless dares. At 17, he'd already gained a reputation in his small town for pushing the boundaries of what was considered safe. His friends knew him as someone who thrived on adventure, always looking for the next thrill. But nothing would have prepared them for the night he dared to enter the storm drains beneath their town, a decision that would ultimately lead to his tragic disappearance. It all started on a Friday evening in early October. The air was crisp, the first signs of fall sweeping through the trees, and the streets were quieter than usual. A group of Liam's friends had gathered at the local diner to hang out, talk about their plans for the weekend, and, as usual, dare each other to do things no one in their right mind would attempt. "Man, you should go explore the storm drains," Tyler had suggested, his voice full of mischief. He was known for coming up with ridiculous dares, but this one seemed different. It wasn't just a dare. It was an invitation into something darker, something unknown. Liam didn't hesitate. He had always been the one to rise to a challenge, and this time was no different. "All right, I'll go down there tonight. I'll make it to the end of the tunnel, no problem," he declared, leaning back in his booth with a confident grin. The others laughed, but Liam didn't care. He wasn't scared of the dark, and the thought of crawling through some underground tunnels sounded more exciting than anything else they could come up with. It was just a storm drain after all, nothing to be afraid of. Later that evening, around midnight, Liam grabbed his backpack, packed a flashlight, and headed out alone. The storm drains were located just outside the town's limits, a network of aging concrete tunnels designed to carry rainwater away from the streets. The entrances to the drains were hidden in a small, overgrown park, and few people ever ventured there, aside from the occasional kid looking to impress their friends. Liam's heart raced with excitement as he approached the first entrance. He could hear the faint rush of water beneath the surface, and the smell of damp earth filled his nostrils. He had done this before in smaller drains, but this was different. This was a larger, more complex system. He had heard rumors from older kids about tunnels that twisted and branched off into darkness, but he wasn't worried. He was sure he'd be fine. He crawled through the narrow, low opening and descended into the darkness below. The flashlight in his hand flickered as he moved deeper, the sound of his shoes splashing in the stagnant water echoing off the tunnel walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. His heartbeat quickened as he ventured farther into the maze of drains, the walls beginning to tighten around him as the space grew narrower. Liam paused for a moment to adjust his flashlight, the beam flickering as he cursed under his breath. He shook the flashlight, hoping it would stabilize, but it only dimmed for a moment before the light returned. He could hear the faint sound of rushing water now, a distant, constant noise that grew louder as he moved further into the system. It was calming in a way, the sound of water moving endlessly towards some unknown end. He walked for what felt like hours, the tunnel branching off in multiple directions. He had no sense of time anymore. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavier with each step. The further he went, the more he felt like something was wrong. The excitement of the dare had worn off, and in its place, an uneasy sense of discomfort settled in his gut. "Maybe I should turn back," Liam muttered to himself. He had wandered far enough now that he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen an entrance. The tunnels were twisting, and there was no clear path leading back. Every corner looked the same, and each tunnel seemed to merge with another, creating an endless web of concrete and water. He turned around, trying to retrace his steps, but it was impossible. The tunnels had confused him. Each direction seemed unfamiliar, and no matter how far he walked, he couldn't find his way back to where he started. The flashlight flickered again, and Liam cursed, shaking it in his hand, trying to get it to stay on. That's when he heard it. A low, distant rumble, the unmistakable sound of water rushing toward him. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint sound in the distance, but it grew louder, a deafening rush of water that seemed to be closing in from all sides. Liam's heart began to race. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he instinctively knew he needed to get out. The water, something about it felt wrong. His breath quickened as he sprinted down the tunnels, his footsteps splashing in the murky water beneath him. But no matter how fast he moved, the sound of the rushing water only grew louder. It was chasing him. Liam's flashlight died. Total darkness enveloped him. Panic set in as he fumbled in his bag, pulling out a spare battery and slapping it into the flashlight. It flickered weakly before coming to life again, casting a faint beam of light on the walls. He looked around frantically, trying to find an exit, but there was nothing. Only the sound of rushing water, closer now, filling the tunnel with its deafening roar. It was impossible to escape. There was no way out. He tried to keep moving, but the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. His legs were aching, his heart racing in terror, but every turn, Every branch of the tunnel only led him deeper into the maze. The water was almost upon him now. He could hear it rising, could feel the cold dampness creeping up his legs. Liam's mind raced. His breath was shallow, his body trembling. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the water, unable to think clearly anymore. The noise of the water was so loud, so overpowering, that he could feel it reverberating in his chest. It was as if the storm drain had come alive, and it was swallowing him whole. He tried to call out, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the water. He was trapped. There was nowhere to go. Night turned into morning, and Liam's disappearance went unnoticed at first. His friends assumed he had gone home after the dare. His parents thought he was spending the night at a friend's house. It wasn't until the following morning that they realized something was wrong. Liam's backpack was found near the entrance to the storm drains, abandoned and untouched. No one could find him. The local authorities were called, and search teams combed the area. But the storm drains were vast and treacherous, and the search yielded no results. Weeks passed without a trace of Liam. The town grew anxious, and rumors began to spread about the drains. Some said there were hidden chambers, others whispered about strange creatures that lurked beneath, but none of that was ever proven. Then, on a cold, overcast morning in November, Liam's body was discovered. It wasn't in one of the main tunnels, but far beneath them, where the water flowed fastest. His body was bloated, unrecognizable, and tangled in the debris that had collected in the dark corners of the storm drain. The water had carried him, as if it had claimed him, and dragged him deep into the forgotten parts of the system. The police couldn't explain how Liam had ended up so far inside the storm drain. They suspected he had drowned after becoming disoriented or perhaps knocked unconscious by something in the water. His flashlight was still clutched in his hand, though it had long since run out of batteries. The drain was sealed off after that, the entrance blocked permanently. But the memory of Liam's disappearance and the mystery surrounding it lingered in the town for years. Some say they can still hear the sound of rushing water late at night, echoing from the storm drains beneath the town, the echo of a lost dare, and the final rush of a life swallowed by the depths. Stanley had always felt a pull toward the unknown, the feeling of discovering something that no one else had ever seen before, the quiet thrill of being the first to lay eyes on a place untouched by time. As an experienced cave explorer, he had seen many of the known passages in Kentucky's vast cave systems. But today, something told him he would find something special, something no one had ever seen before. It was a crisp autumn morning when Stanley set out on his solo journey. He'd packed the usual gear, headlamp, climbing rope, food, and water, and checked his equipment twice. Solo exploration was his preferred way to cave. It was a solitary experience, just him and the dark, uncharted tunnels. He felt free here, away from the world. The thrill of being deep underground where no one else had ventured was his kind of peace. As he entered the cave system, the air grew cooler and damper. He followed familiar routes, squeezing through tight corridors, his headlamp casting eerie shadows along the jagged walls. He smiled to himself, marveling at the beauty of it all. The strange, smooth formations, the mineral deposits on the cave's floor, the low drip of water from stalactites overhead. Hours passed, and Stanley ventured deeper into the cave, pushing forward without hesitation. He had been here before, but this time something was different. The tunnel narrowed, the air became heavier, more still, as if he were entering a place untouched by human feet for centuries. He paused, taking in the stillness of it all. Then, he noticed it, a narrow passage, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. His heart raced. He had found something no one else had seen. He felt the adrenaline surge in his veins as he dropped to his knees and began to crawl into the tight opening. The walls pressed in around him as he slid further, each movement more difficult than the last. But Stanley didn't care. This was what he lived for, the excitement of discovery. As he crawled, the passage seemed to close in even more, the rocks scraping against his arms, his chest tight as he tried to maneuver forward. His excitement blinded him to the caution he should have heeded. The space was getting tighter, more confined. But still, he pressed on, thrilled by the thought of the uncharted world ahead of him. Then, without warning, his foot slipped. It wasn't a hard fall, not at first. Just a shift, a slight movement. But the narrow passageway, already so tight, suddenly became unbearable. Stanley's body was wedged between two solid rock walls. Panic shot through him like an electric current, his breath catching in his throat. He pushed with his hands, trying to free himself, but the more he struggled, the tighter the space seemed to become. He tried to stay calm, telling himself it was just a temporary problem. He had been in tight spots before. He would shift his weight, move his limbs, and slide right back out. But no matter how he twisted and turned, he couldn't budge. His body was stuck, wedged so tightly that the rocks felt like they were pressing in from all sides. His heart pounded as the realization set in. He was trapped. The walls closed in around him, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him, heavier than the stones that surrounded him. His mind raced, searching for a solution. But there was nothing, no way out. "Help!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the narrow tunnel. "Someone, please help me!" The words fell into the darkness, swallowed by the cave. No answer came. No footsteps, no voices, only the dripping water in the distance, the sound of his own breath in his ears. Stanley tried again to shift his position, his body aching from the strain, but it was useless. The more he moved, the tighter the rocks seemed to hold him in place. He gritted his teeth, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't even turn his head to look around. All he could see was the jagged stone pressing close around him, the dim light of his headlamp casting flickering shadows on the walls. Hours passed, maybe more. Time lost its meaning in the claustrophobic darkness. He shifted from one position to another, trying to find a way to loosen himself, but every attempt failed. His limbs were sore from the awkward position, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he lay there, wedged in the unforgiving rock. His food and water were gone within a few hours. Stanley didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. He tried to scream again, but his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper in the oppressive silence. There was no one to hear him. Nightfall came, but there was no change. The cave was as silent as ever, the air growing colder as time dragged on. Stanley couldn't help but feel the weight of his isolation. This place, once so thrilling, now felt like a tomb. He was alone, and the dark was pressing in on him from all sides. Then, in the stillness of the cave, Stanley thought he heard something. A sound, footsteps. Faint at first, then louder, closer. His heart jumped in his chest. Someone was out there. He wasn't alone. He called out, his voice raw and desperate. "Hey, can you hear me?" The footsteps stopped. Stanley held his breath, waiting. His heart pounded in his ears, but no reply came. The footsteps had faded, leaving only silence. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? He couldn't be sure, but he had to keep trying. He screamed again, his voice cracking with desperation. For a moment, the footsteps returned. Closer now. Stanley felt a flicker of hope. Someone was coming. But again, no one appeared. The footsteps circled around him, growing fainter until they disappeared completely. The silence returned, deeper than before. No voices, no sounds of rescue. Just the dark, the cold, and the ever-looming rock walls. Stanley's breathing grew shallow as exhaustion began to take its toll. His body ached, his muscles screamed in pain, and his mind felt like it was beginning to unravel. The passage, which once had seemed like a thrilling discovery, now felt like a prison. Time had lost its meaning, and the cave felt like it was closing in around him. His phone had no signal, and his supplies were gone. He had nothing left but his own thoughts and the weight of the rock pressing in on him. Days passed, maybe weeks. He wasn't sure. His strength was failing him, and with it, his resolve. He had stopped trying to scream. There was no one out there to hear him. There was no way out. He was stuck, alone in the dark. Stanley's body grew weak, his limbs stiff from the strain of being in the same position for so long. The cold seeped into his bones, and he wondered if he would ever see the light of day again. Would anyone ever find him? Or would he simply disappear into the darkness of the cave? Another forgotten soul lost beneath the earth. A month later, a rescue team reached the cave. They'd been searching for weeks, drawn by the trail of abandoned equipment and the faint signs of Stanley's presence. When they reached the narrow passage, they found what they had feared. Stanley's body was wedged so tightly between the rocks that it took hours to remove him. The rocks had claimed him, trapping him in their unforgiving grip. No one would ever know what truly happened during those final days. His phone had no signal, and his equipment provided no clues. Stanley had been alone, and the cave had swallowed him whole. The narrow passage that had once seemed so thrilling had become his tomb, and the cave, as silent and unyielding as ever, kept its secret. It was a typical Saturday night at the roadside butcher shop. The shop had seen its last customer of the day, a regular who grabbed a couple of steaks before heading home for the weekend. At midnight, with the last of the lights flickering off, Mike, the shop's lone employee, was finishing up the final tasks, wiping down counters, sharpening knives, and locking up the meat cases. He worked alone most weekends, the quiet routine giving him a certain peace. But tonight, something would change. Mike had always been meticulous about everything. He knew his way around the shop like the back of his hand. The butcher shop, situated on the outskirts of town, was the kind of place that stayed open late for people who needed fresh cuts or last-minute ingredients. He didn't mind the solitude, the hum of the refrigerator units, the occasional car passing by on the road, and the smell of fresh meat filled the air. It was a comforting mix of routine and purpose. The freezer was the last thing to be checked. He stood before the massive industrial freezer, a heavy door with thick steel hinges that always made a satisfying thud when it shut. He had closed it hundreds of times before without incident, but tonight, it felt different. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on. Maybe he was just tired from a long day of slicing, but there was an odd feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. He stepped inside the freezer to make sure that cuts of meat were hung properly. He knew they were going to be, but he was used to being thorough. As he walked to the back, the door behind him clicked shut. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a metal click that echoed in the sudden silence. He paused. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Of course, locked myself in. He didn't panic immediately. It was a heavy door, but it wasn't impenetrable. He had keys in his pocket after all. A quick tug on the door handle and it would open. But when he grabbed the handle, it didn't budge. The mechanism was locked from the outside. At first, he laughed. He figured someone must have been playing a prank, but then it hit him. No one else was in the shop. The owner was at home with his family, and the shop didn't open on Sundays. Mike was alone. A sinking feeling crawled up his spine, but he shook it off. He couldn't panic. He had worked here for years. The freezer was big, and the door had a safety release. There was no need to freak out. He would be fine. But the minutes passed, and the cold began to settle in. He turned to the door again, pulling at the handle, slamming his shoulder into it once, twice, nothing. He could feel the icy grip of the freezer seep into his bones. His breath became visible in the air. "Come on, Mike, get it together," he muttered to himself, pacing back and forth. The rhythmic thud of his boots on the frozen floor was the only sound in the small, isolated chamber. He banged on the door with his fist and screamed, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. No one could hear him. The butcher shop had no neighbors for miles, and the traffic on the road outside had dwindled hours ago. The windows were too thick to hear anything over the hum of the refrigeration units. He was alone, trapped. The seconds stretched into minutes, the minutes into hours. He had no way of knowing how much time had passed, but the cold was unbearable now. His fingers were stiff, his body beginning to shake from the frost that seemed to sink into his very bones. He found a small corner by the wall and huddled there, trying to conserve warmth, but it was futile. The cold was everywhere, seeping into him. His teeth began to chatter, and a dull ache spread from his joints. The only thing he could think about was getting out. The door, which had been his escape, now became his enemy. His eyes darted to it constantly, each glance punctuated by an irrational hope that it would open, that he would see someone standing there, someone who could get him out. But each time, nothing changed. Time, however, was not his ally. The minutes became hours. His breath came in slower, more labored bursts. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. His feet felt like blocks of ice, and his legs were stiff as though they didn't belong to him anymore. The air around him became a solid wall of cold, each exhale of breath turning to frost before his eyes. He tried again. Desperately, he pulled at the handle, tried kicking the door, slamming it with his shoulder. Nothing. His hands were raw, his fingernails broken from the effort, but it made no difference. It was useless. The only sound was the soft hum of the freezer, a low, monotonous noise that seemed to mock his efforts. Hours stretched on, each one more agonizing than the last. His body began to shake uncontrollably from the cold, his mind starting to slow, his vision blurred, the sharpness of the world around him dulling. The cold was all-consuming, suffocating, and he couldn't escape it. He couldn't even remember what warmth felt like anymore. He slumped against the door, his head spinning. He couldn't move, he couldn't think. It felt like the cold was reaching deep inside him, freezing everything. The thoughts, the panic, the fear. He was growing numb, and with it, a strange sense of peace. Time continued to slip by. Sunday passed without incident. Mike didn't wake up. His body lay frozen, still as the meat stored around him, a grotesque irony in the cold. When Monday came, the shop owner arrived at the butcher shop, as he always did, to check on things before opening for the week. He turned the key in the lock and realized it was already open. He thought maybe Mike had come in early. He stepped inside, expecting to get things ready for the day's customers. But something was wrong. Mike was nowhere to be found. The freezer door was still shut tight. It didn't seem unusual at first, but when he went to pull the heavy door open, it wouldn't budge. A feeling of unease crept over him. The lock hadn't been tampered with. He pulled harder, but the door stayed shut. The panic began to rise. Finally, with an unexpected burst of force, the door gave way. It swung open with a loud creak, and Mike's body spilled out into the cold, stiff as a statue. His skin was pale, nearly blue, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His fingers were broken, torn from desperate attempts to claw his way out, but it had been too late. The cold had consumed him completely. The shop owner stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Mike was gone, lost to the cold in the very place he had worked for years. No one had known he was there. No one had heard him scream. He was alone when he died, his last breath trapped in the icy air. The shop owner called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was little left to say. The freezer was locked, and the only thing left of Mike was the tragic reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. He had simply been forgotten in a place that was meant to keep things fresh, but instead, it had claimed a life, his life, along with the fresh cuts of meat that lined its shelves. Tessa had always been a little impulsive when it came to her work. As a realtor, she had a knack for spotting hidden gems in rundown properties. That afternoon, after finishing up a meeting with clients in the city, she drove down a rural back road to a property she'd only briefly glanced at earlier. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. There was something peaceful about the isolation, something that made Tessa curious. She had driven past the old farm a few times and decided it wouldn't hurt to take a quick look before heading home. The owners had been trying to sell the place for months, but the property had been on the market for so long that the listing had become a joke. The barn was falling apart and the house had been empty for years, but Tessa saw potential. Maybe with the right renovations, someone would fall in love with the place. Her phone had died an hour ago, and she hadn't realized it until she was miles away from the nearest gas station. As Tessa stepped out of her car, she didn't mind much. She never relied too heavily on her phone anyway. She just wanted to get a feel for the property, get a sense of what it might need. She wandered around the yard first, taking in the crumbling fences and the overgrown grass. The house was set back from the road, its roof sagging under years of neglect. But it was the well, sitting alone in the center of the field, that caught her attention. It was old, probably as old as the house, and the stonework around it was weathered and worn. Tessa couldn't help herself. She walked over to it, drawn by the curiosity that always led her to places like this. She peered over the edge, squinting to see if there was anything at the bottom. The well was deep, too deep for her to make out anything, but that didn't stop her from leaning in closer. It was at that moment, as she leaned a little too far, that the bricks beneath her feet gave way. Tessa gasped as the ground crumbled beneath her, and in a split second, she was falling. Her body twisted in the air, her arms flailing as she tried to catch herself, but it was all in vain. The fall felt endless, like the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her whole. She landed with a sickening thud at the bottom, the wind knocked out of her. For a moment, everything was silent, the world spinning around her as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She could feel the sharp sting of pain shooting up her legs and arms. Her chest tightened, but she didn't panic. Not yet. She pushed herself up, grimacing as the bruises on her limbs throbbed. The darkness was thick, swallowing everything around her. The only light came from the faint glow of the dying sun above, casting long shadows down the narrow shaft. She had no idea how far she'd fallen, but judging by the ringing in her ears and the dull ache in her body, it wasn't just a few feet. She tried calling out, but the walls of the well muffled her voice. Her words didn't seem to carry. She screamed anyway, the sound of her own voice echoing back at her, swallowed by the earth. No one would hear her, she realized. The farm was so far off the beaten path that there was no one nearby to help. Her phone was in her car, dead, and no one knew she was here. Tessa's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to get her bearings. She pushed herself against the slick, moss-covered walls, slipping against the smooth surface, leaving no traction, trying to find a handhold. Her fingers scraped the wet stone. She pulled herself up anyway, kicking against the wall with all the strength she could muster, but it was no use. The well was too deep, the walls too smooth. She fell back to the ground, breathless and defeated. The light above her had already faded, the sky growing darker by the minute. The last traces of sunset slipped away, leaving only shadows and the heavy silence of the earth. Tessa could feel the panic creeping in now, gnawing at her chest. She was stuck. There was no one around, no one who would come for her. It was just her and the cold, wet darkness. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to lose its meaning. She couldn't tell if the quiet was comforting or suffocating. Her arms burned from the attempts to climb, and the bruises on her hands were growing worse. She could feel the rough skin where her palms had scraped against the stone, the blood mixing with the dirt. She wiped her hand across her face, only to smear mud into her eyes. Her breath was shallow, and a sense of helplessness took root in the pit of her stomach. "Someone will come," she muttered to herself, but her voice cracked, betraying the fear she was trying to hide. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it wasn't as hopeless as it felt. But deep down, she knew the truth. No one was coming. The silence was suffocating, and the cold began to seep into her bones. It was hard to tell how much time had passed. Her thoughts were muddled, her mind too tired to focus. She couldn't stop herself from shivering. She'd never felt so alone. Not like this. Tessa tried to scream again. Her voice sounded weak, too small to reach the surface. She collapsed back onto the ground, curling up as the first signs of desperation crept in. She closed her eyes, not wanting to face the truth but knowing it was there all the same. The night stretched on. Hours felt like days as she lay there, her body aching, her hands raw from trying to climb. The cold seeped into her clothes, her fingers stiffening as the darkness deepened. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of decay, of the earth swallowing everything, including hope. Tessa stopped screaming. There was no use. She had called out until her throat was raw, her voice barely more than a whisper now. The silence around her felt more suffocating with each passing minute. Her body had stopped aching, numb from hours, or was it days, of exhaustion. She lay there, eyes closed, barely aware of the cold creeping deeper into her bones. She had no idea how long she'd been in the well, but it felt like forever. The first day, she had tried again to climb, desperate, scraping her hands raw against the slick stone. But the well never gave, and soon her attempts grew weaker. The second day, her system had rationed what little water was left in her body, but it wasn't enough. Dehydration began to set in, the dry, cracked feeling in her mouth becoming unbearable. Her stomach ached, hollow, empty. The days blurred together. She wasn't sure if it was the third or fourth day when she finally stopped trying to call for help, her voice too weak to make any sound. She simply lay there, too tired to move, too thirsty to care. The darkness pressed in around her, and soon she could barely tell where the well ended and her body began. By the end of the week, her body had shut down. She lay motionless at the bottom of the well, too far gone for anyone to hear. The farm remained silent, untouched by human presence. When they found her, it was too late. Her hands were still raw, bruised from the climb that never came to be. No one would ever know the agony she'd endured alone in the darkness, waiting for help that would never arrive.